I'd just like to acknowledge we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So look, it's a really wonderful thing for us to be here tonight. We're so thankful for you coming out. Now tonight's tangent talk is called Liar, Liar, Rants of Fire, relating to our soon to open production of Patrick Hamilton's classic play Gaslight, which is starts previews on September 3rd at Her Majesty's Theatre. So we're very lucky with the assistance of the Adelaide Festival Centre. We were doing the show in the Playhouse, but because of capacity restrictions with COVID, we're flipping it to Her Majesty's. And you know, while we don't want obviously COVID to be a thing, going to Her Majesty's is quite nice. It's a beautiful theatre. Anyone had a tour in there so far? Yes, a couple of people. It's magnificent, and Ailsa Patterson's beautiful design is going to look spectacular in there, and the dressing rooms are fabulous. So already there's fights about who gets 1 and 2, and 1 is particularly sublime. So I think Ksenia Lopez will get that. So that's really exciting, and we're very grateful to the assistance of SA Health as well, who've been advising the Festival Centre in terms of how the capacity will work, in terms of protocols for the theatre, etc., so that everybody's is safe primarily and then can enjoy the show after that also. Obviously this year's been a challenging time for everyone and across the planet, and for our company it's been an interesting time. We've had to cancel 5 shows this year after Dance Nation, Adelaide. So we cancelled after doing 2 previews at Belvoir. But we've been incredibly buoyed by the support of everybody from our subscribers and our ticket buyers and our donors and our artists during this time. Many have donated their ticket costs back to us, but many have also sent many wonderful kind of messages of support, which has been fantastic for the company. So we thank you, and we thank you for coming tonight too. You may have seen, some of you, during this time we've been doing a digital project called Decameron 2.0, which has been fantastic, collaborating with Act Now Theatre with the assistance of Department of Premier and Cabinet, which has been wonderful. And by the time we finished in a couple of weeks, Clara is one of our directors on it, we'll have employed about 100 different actors, writers and directors during this time, and doing all original work and wonderful work and stuff that they can go forward and put on their show reels and get out there. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience for the company and lots of new faces, which has been great. Tonight, these wonderful panellists we've got joined with me tonight, a fantastic array of people here. Professor Sarah Wendt here. Sarah is currently the Professor of Social Work and Director of the Social Work Innovation Research Living Space at Flinders University. Prior to academia, Sarah practiced in the field of domestic violence. She's taught in social work for over a decade and has published on violence against women and social work practice. Particular research projects explore the impact of domestic violence on women's citizenship, service provision in the field of domestic violence, young women's experiences of violence and abuse, and engaging men to address domestic violence, and has just written a report on that, which is in the latest Flinders magazine, if anybody's a Flinders alumni here. More recently, she's been researching collaboration across child protection and domestic violence sectors. Sarah's published 3 books on domestic violence and over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles. Please welcome Sarah to the panel tonight. Next to Sarah, we've got Amber Owen, who's the principal clinical psychologist and founder of Mindful Pathways. She has a passion for guiding people to find ways to live more meaningful, fulfilling lives, and her goal is to empower, inspire, and transform individuals and organisations. Amber was educated here in Australia and in the United Kingdom and has worked as a psychologist in Adelaide, Sydney and London. She's a Master of Psychology, a Bachelor of Psychology, and is a member of the Australian Psychological Society. Please welcome Amber to the panel. Associate Professor Julia Erhart here. Julia is a feminist film scholar and internationally recognised researcher on women's screen practice, including women's interventions into the industries of independent and commercial feature filmmaking. Julia is the author of 2 books, Gendering History on Screen, Women Filmmakers and Historical Films, and Gillian Armstrong, Popular, Sensual and Ethical Cinema. I did one of the worst auditions I've ever done in my life for Gillian Armstrong, so we'll talk about that over a drink afterwards. A second prong of Julia's research investigates the relationship between Australian cultural identities and screen production, particularly how Australasian media makers shift the needle on conversations about gender, race, sexuality and belonging. Julia has produced substantial research on engagement with commercial media by LGBTIQ audiences, raised in New York City, worked for New Line Cinema, Paperjacks, and is also a freelance film editor. Please welcome Julia. And someone you may have seen at our tangents before, our wonderful emerging director fellow, sponsored by the Helpmann Academy and James and Dana Ramsey Foundation, Clara Solly-Slade. Clara was the assistant director on Dance Nation, Animal Farm and A View from the Bridge, and for Soza, A Cunning Little Vixen, Madeline Lee and Madame Butterfly. She's a graduate at the Adelaide College of Arts and the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and the La Mama Experimental Theatre Company at its symposium in Italy. Please welcome Clara. As you'll say, Clara's working on a new play with the fabulous South Australian playwright Sophia Simmons, who wrote Limit, which was in our umbrella season last year. And they're working on a play called Speculative Friction, which is kind of inspired by Gaslight, so we'll get there a bit later on. So who's seen Gaslight the Film? Oh, not everybody, okay. So the play by Patrick Hamilton was written in 1938 and then has been made into 3 films, the most famous being the 1944 film with Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer, directed by George Cukor, which won Ingrid Bergman the Academy Award. The first Australian production I discovered on the weekend was at the Minerva Theatre in King's Cross in 1939. And the first production in Adelaide was in 1940 by the Marion Sauer Players. Anyone? And there was a live recording of an Australian production in 1958 for the ABC with the beautiful Beverly Dunn, who was a dear mate of mine. In our production, Catherine Fitzgerald, former associate artist at State Theatre Company, is kind of re-interrogating the play while still honouring its kind of classic thriller traditions with a few twists and turns that you may not be expecting. But already they're doing some great work in that rehearsal room, so I think it's going to be a pretty electric night in the theatre. And we're selling really well too, so if you haven't got a ticket, get in quick. There's a great quote in regards to an off-Broadway revival in 2007 from the New York Times, which said, "Gaslight established the blueprint for a kind of domestic peril thriller. Every time an actress portrays the sort of wife who discovers that the greatest threat to her mental and physical safety is the man sitting in her breakfast nook, Mr. Hamilton's estate ought to receive some type of remuneration. Mr. Hamilton believed our most dangerous enemies were always in the room with us." Now the plot, many of you may know about, but involves our heroine Bella Manningham and her husband Jack, who sets about on a task of isolating and belittling her and making her think she's insane. Jack terrorises his wife Bella into questioning her reality by blaming her for mischievously misplacing household items, which he systematically hides. Doubting whether her perspective can be trusted, Bella clings to a single shred of evidence, the dimming of the gaslights that accompany the late-night execution of Jack's trickery. Like many words or phrases that have entered the dictionary, Shakespeare wins that race, things like cruel to be kind and breaking the ice and jealousy is the green-eyed monster. Gaslight is a term that has entered popular culture and our lexicon. The term was first thought to be coined by psychotherapists Barton and Whitehead in their 1969 Lancet paper, The Gaslight Phenomenon, that analysed involuntary hospitalisation as a form of abuse. The term appeared variously in lots of psychotherapeutic literature in the 70s and 80s. There was a book called The Gaslight Effect in 2007, which further popularised the term. And a great book called Gaslighting, which I got in the mail a few weeks ago by Stephanie Sarkis. But reading it, as I was saying to the panel before, it brought up lots of kind of experiences in my own life where I'd been gaslit. I thought, I don't want to read this is true traumatic. So we'll get the trauma on during this session tonight. The term was made an official part of criminal domestic violence law in the UK in 2015, and more than 300 people have been charged with the offence since. It's a term that we've heard a lot about during the Me Too movement as well, in which many alleged assailants use it to categorise their partners as crazy, hysterical, and or prone to exaggeration. And certainly in terms of politics, it's been most famously applied recently to a gentleman called Donald Trump, who has, in many people's view, deliberately attempted to destabilise journalism as a check on the power of government. More on Donald a little bit later. So throwing to our panel now, Julia, a question for you, given you're here to my left. It's a film, Gaslight, that has had enormous tentacles into other films and TV productions and pieces of literature since then. Why do you think it's had such a profound effect on other kind of films like that? What's the secret of that term and that practice?
Well, thanks so much, Michelle, and also thanks, by the way, also for inviting me. I'm super chuffed to be here. I'm a big fan of this movie as well. I think, look, this isn't a dodge, but in some ways, to answer that, you sort of have to go out and ask the people who plunked down your money, right? I mean, it's, a film scholar can only really talk about the industry, which in some ways tries to market things along a certain line to pick up the zeitgeist of the moment. But whether something really gets picked up or not, it's always a bit of a crapshoot. What we do know is that yes, this type of movie, this theme of a woman being on her own, threatened within the house, is incredibly pervasive. I mean, it was a cycle of 1940s films, as I think you pretty much said. So starting with something like Rebecca, you all may be aware of, from 1940, fairly similar, a woman with disproportionately less power, meets a glamorous and wealthy man, falls in love very quickly, gets swept off her feet, moves in, and paranoia ensues. So that was in a way the model, 1940. Gaslight comes right in the middle, 44, and then I think a few more to pretty much the end of the decade, concluding off with something like The Two Mrs. Carrolls and The Spiral Staircase, and there's just a little nice mini cycle there. So obviously really popular at that time. The other thing though that we want to remember is that if we look, zoom forward into the current day, things like The Panic Room with Jodie Foster from 2002, I think, or What Lies Beneath, which is Michelle Pfeiffer from 2000. And I was excitedly telling everybody I saw The Invisible Man last night. So, it's, enduring, I guess is the word. Why, if I was to hedge a bit of a bet, first of all, hugely adaptable. So, we can have one heroine in 1944 who, I think Ingrid Bergman, I'm not familiar with the play by the way, but I'm thinking she's not marked as a career person, she's a wife at that time. Fast forward to Elizabeth Moss, she's an architect, right? So it's all kind of heavily adaptable for the contemporary moment in which the story takes place. And we can look at further adaptations as we talk more, but I would say also that Hollywood has worked out that for those of us who are not going to the majority of filmmaking, which is the superhero-driven, the Marvel comic-driven, the DC, which is like about 90% of the filmmaking, for better or for worse, female complexity sells. And, I'm here to make a pitch that these are actually quite complex films. I mean, they show women at their most profound, vulnerable, but they have often a rise above narrative at the end where the woman kind of triumphs and forges ahead. So yeah, female complexity actually does sell.
But it's interesting too, isn't it? Like the notion of the mad woman, which is a kind of trope in literature and opera. That thing about, the women being hysterical, and the word coming from the Greek word for uterus, that inherently femininity is weak and crazy, whereas masculinity is strength. That's something weird that we see in our films as well, isn't it?
Yes, but don't we then, I'm saying we women, that's a bit, perhaps funny, forgive me for that, but doesn't that leave women in a better position, arguably, in some ways? I mean, Ingrid Bergman won the Oscar for this, not Charles Boyer, and she eclipsed him as, in all the promotional materials, she was the heavy hitter. In fact, that film makes a departure from the British one, which had been a bit more, that you mentioned the 1941, was a bit more about the man's story. And so when Bergman takes it, it really goes forward as a woman's story. So I think, so much the better in a way. I'm not talking about the real situation, of course, of women, but as a venue, as a cultural moment, I think it's great to have that complexity there.
It's interesting too, in Gaslight, unlike many other films where the hero, she makes her own decision about this is incorrect. In Gaslight, there's a kind of mansplaining inspector who arrives and is like, oh no, I know what's going on here. And Catherine's doing some interesting stuff with that. But certainly, it's like The Girl on the Train with Emily Blunt recently. There's so many films where the female is questioned, isn't there? Which is
question, but also we're actually in her shoes. We're seeing through her eyes. So in the Elizabeth Moss recent film, I mean, we are right on her side. So even though she is being disbelieved by everybody and essentially is institutionalized, you know, it's a harrowing film. I do recommend it, but absolutely harrowing. We're right there with her. So these women are not other to us. We are actually invited, possibly male audience members as well, to see things from their place in their shoes. So I think that's a powerful, you know, if art can do that, what else do we want from it?
That's pretty good, big tick. Yeah, wonderful, thanks. Amber, so gaslighting, the actual term, it's something that's been used a lot in practice now, and obviously it's a zeitgeist term as well. Is it a term that you've come across a lot in your practice? Do clients actually know how to name that as a pattern of behaviour?
It definitely comes up frequently in my practice, and I think for a lot of my clients, they have a real aha moment when they first hear about the term gaslighting, or they read something and can articulate what might be happening for them in their relationships, and you know, actually make sense of and communicate more effectively what's happening for them. Definitely.
And what, I mean, whether or not you know the play or not, but what are some of the hallmarks of gaslighting per se?
Yeah. Okay, I've got a list, so I might check that I'm checking them all off. But things like telling really blatant lies, which is kind of a confusional method, because if someone tells you blatant lies, then you feel quite confused about what to believe and not to believe. So this kind of confusional stuff, a lot of denying that something's been said. So even when it's blatantly obvious again that has been said, or there's evidence or proof that something's been said. Using what's near and dear to you as ammunition against you. So lots of kind of threatening behaviours. The analogy or metaphor of the frog in the fry pan, I don't know if anyone's heard of that before, but this idea that the fry pan is slowly heating up and the frog doesn't actually know what's happening. I see that really, really frequently in my clients that are experiencing gaslighting and emotional abuse. You know, there's just kind of an accumulative effect of abuse over time, and it's really difficult for them to actually see how bad it is. Actions not matching words, so a whole lot of I give you everything, and you know, I've been so supportive, and this kind of stuff that comes up so frequently when the actions just do not match those words at all. And then there's the throwing in of positive reinforcement, so that intermittent positive reinforcement, which really makes it even more difficult for someone to leave. So this kind of, you know, I can't believe how amazing he's been. He's like his old self again this week, you know, took me out for a wonderful dinner and has treated me so well, and perhaps it wasn't all that bad after all. Perhaps I was, you know, making it up or exaggerating what had happened.
Is it very, one of the most traumatic things in some of the reading I've been doing about double-bind parenting, which is the notion of parents being incredibly cruel to the children, but then incredibly positive and loving afterwards.
Absolutely.
So the child has no, and you see that in adult relationships too, but
Yeah.
the inconsistency is actually the killer, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, and it makes someone very confused and insecure. So yeah, that's really, really common as well. So a lot of confusion, a lot of questioning sanity, a lot of projection. So if they're doing something wrong, like cheating for example, they're probably accusing their partner of cheating a lot. Aligning people against you, isolating and telling others that you're a bit crazy, that kind of thing.
And certainly something that happens in the play too, where Jack Manningham brings in the various kind of staff and like, did you see the picture frame here, you know, and did you see this? And like, let's all gang in on Bella.
Absolutely.
It's a horrific thing, yeah.
And then also turning you yourself against everyone else, so telling you that everyone else is a liar and that you can't trust them as well, which makes it really, really difficult. So they're probably a few of the hallmarks.
Yeah, yucky stuff. So Sarah obviously worked very much in this field. And actually I was reading your report actually about engaging men who do use violence. It's such a bizarre think, what do you think it is, Sarah? What is the reason that it's a kind of pattern of behaviour that is so often invoked by people? Why do people think that gaslighting is a useful kind of pathway to getting what they want in a relationship?
Yeah, Mitchell, like Mitchell said, so what Amber's just described is really, really familiar to me in terms of understanding domestic and family violence. And so in the literature or the research on domestic and family violence, they often call it coercive control. So gaslighting or the emotional abuse that Amber's just described very well for everyone, in the domestic violence literature we would call that coercive control. And so it is about a partner, and the statistics show it's predominantly men that perpetrate this behaviour, is they use a range of tactics to control their female partners. And so we say coercive control is about power, it's about isolation, it's about intimidation, manipulation, and that often has a lot of significance because it's surrounded by other tactics that perpetrators in domestic violence will use. And so domestic violence is not only emotional or psychological abuse, which has been described very well by Amber, it's often surrounded by other behaviours like sexual violence or physical violence. It's also surrounded by what we call social abuse. So this emotional abuse often comes with isolating women from their families and friends. So women in domestic violence relationships often end up alone. They don't have any networks or friends or families to kind of check in with anymore. They become very reliant on their perpetrator, and that's the goal. And also domestic violence is often reinforced through financial abuse or control. So women often lose access to their material being practicalities, finances, education, employment, all those things get eroded over time. And so gaslighting, the concept of gaslighting becomes so powerful because it's also surrounded by these other forms of abuse. And the thing with domestic violence is, a bit like gaslighting, and the frog in the frying pan, this behaviour doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates, it is subtle, it starts to grow in intensity. And women then end up second guessing themselves about this. And then when you get isolated from family and friends, or you're not feeling very good about yourself, you can see how it goes on and on and on. So it becomes accumulative, these kind of behaviours.
And it's kind of at the centre of it, isn't it, too?
It
kind of
is,
surreality of,
yeah.
I must be doing this myself,
Yes.
or I'm causing it, which is so incredibly toxic.
And so also the concept with gaslighting and domestic violence is interesting because my research with men who use violence and how one engages men to have a look at this kind of behaviour, it is shown over and over again that when we talk to men about their use of violence or these tactics, men deny it, or they'll minimise it, or they actually justify it. And so to try and have those engagement conversations about that this is, a pattern of behaviour over time and is actually causing significant harm, unfortunately men have really good narratives about justifying it, minimising it, denying it. But that also comes from social messages, about how we understand intimate relationships, how we understand masculinity, femininity, gender. So men draw on these big kind of discourses or narratives to actually justify their behaviour.
There was a great article that I think I shared with you, The Sociology of Gaslighting, where I think Paige Lee was her name. She talks about it's not just an individual phenomenon, but it is a kind of social, gendered phenomenon, the notion of it's okay for me to portray you as crazy, or one story of a gentleman holding his wife in a bath because she needed to calm down. So it is a large gendered problem, isn't it? Not just an individual one.
And I was really struck with what Julia was saying about the female character, how we can see it through her eyes, or audiences end up empathising, wanting to understand. It's interesting coming from the field of domestic violence, or looking at it in terms of service provision or the law. That is often the opposite for everyday women. So everyday women are the stories of them not being believed are really, really common. It is very hard in law to prove it or to get a conviction for this stuff. And also our kind of family and friend networks, women tell us over and over again that people don't want to believe that that's what he would do. He's a good bloke. It's only when he's drinking don't upset him. It's because he's stressed. So as a society, it's interesting in films, we're drawn to it, but in the everyday life, it is so common that as a society, we can't believe men do this, and we can't believe women. We actually have, it's more comfortable for us to say, well, she obviously did it, or she's provoking him. So this kind of, it's interesting that we don't see it in the everyday.
There's a great play called Girls and Boys that I tried to get for our company, but Melbourne Theatre Company beat me to it, in which there's a portrayal of family violence in it. But the notion is kind of raised that ultimately civilization on many levels is just a construct to control men's impulses. Like invariably, you know, most of the violence is, as you say, data after data shows that is men inflicting this violence, which is interesting and bizarre. But I guess the question is also what are the kind of strategies around that? Like if we say, is it to say to a man, oh, this is a form of personality disorder, or it's a function of masculinity? Is gaslighting a form of narcissistic personality disorder, or is it just something that we expect in the masculine per se?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. So, you know, not putting words in Amber's mouth, but Amber might come up with a different response to me being a sociologist or a social worker. So, and I think there is no right or wrong. I think both have legitimacy. So coming from a social work hat or a sociologist, and very much being influenced by feminist thinking, the argument that sits comfortably with me is that domestic violence or gaslighting or these forms of abuse are actually driven by larger gender inequality. And so when I say gender inequality, you know, I'm talking material, I'm talking cultural, I'm talking historical, I'm talking law, I'm talking media, I'm talking family institution. These big drivers enable gender inequality. And so when you have a look at a phenomenon like domestic violence, there is this kind of saying that gender inequality causes domestic violence, but domestic violence continues to perpetuate gender inequality. They self-feed each other. And so maybe that's why we struggle as a society so much to confront this issue of domestic violence, because it requires us to take a step back and have those uncomfortable conversations about gender inequality. And at the moment in contemporary society, there is still debate around that. Of course there's gender equality, but no, there's not. Yeah, so it's a really uncomfortable conversation to be had for society in and of itself, let alone try and confront an issue like domestic violence, which is driven by gender inequality.
What do you reckon, Amber?
Completely agree, actually. So I guess what we would say is that some personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, that although gaslighting wouldn't be a criteria for those disorders, that they may kind of show up in the ways in which the symptoms are kind of expressed. But I think it's really important that we don't kind of overemphasise that, because as well as that, we know about personality disorders that people with any mental health condition or a personality disorder are actually probably at greater risk themselves of being exposed to emotional, physical, sexual abuse, financial abuse. Yes. And so I think although, you know, there could be a correlation there between gaslighting and narcissistic personality or antisocial personality, there's also potential that they have an increased risk of experiencing those things themselves.
Well, yeah. Because I guess common to both, though, is the notion of a lack of empathy, isn't there? Like, that's very common to personality disorders and narcissism particularly, but also to gaslighting. The fact that you can't go, oh, I feel what the response of this would be. Yeah. Maybe Clara, maybe a good point to bring Clara in. So as I said, Clara is working on a play called Speculative Friction with Sophia Simmons, which is kind of about technological gaslighting. The notion that gaslighting can actually happens on a kind of larger techno basis. Maybe Clara, you could speak to the research you've been doing.
Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons that I love, is this working? Yes.
Lisa, do you want to?
I can also
thank you.
loudly.
Project.
One of the reasons that I love Sophia's work as a writer is she's really interested.
Oh, we'll just sort that out. Thanks, Alyssa.
Sorry. Do you want to swap them?
We can't do the COVID swap.
Hello.
There we go.
One of the amazing things about Sophia's writing is she's really intelligent writer, but she's really interested in kind of technology and science fiction, and kind of uses these ideas as like a bit of a vessel to kind of explore other stuff. But she found a statistic, which is not a science fiction statistic, which is about kind of people's domestic violence perpetrators starting to use automated house technology as a tool to control partners. And it's really funny that you speak about the frog in the pan analogy, because if you literally kind of can control central heating from another room, or music, or lighting, or locks, or CCTV footage inside your house, and there's a lot of cases of people, which I'm sure you guys have all experienced, people installing spyware on their partner's phone, which is kind of targeted as catch your cheating spouse or keep an eye on your kids, which gives you access to your partner's photos and messages and bank accounts and internet browser history and everything. So how do you escape a situation when you can't pack a bag and you can't ring a friend and you can't go on the internet and you can't do all of these things? So yeah, that was kind of like the impetus to going into this and just finding kind of more stuff in this world. And then we're kind of also really interested, I guess, with how we're giving over our privacy to technology on another level, and also, you know, the introduction of automated technology, and in the not too distant future, how does artificial intelligence start to come into that, and even kind of like gender around how automated houses are always female voices because they're of service, and kind of, so there's kind of all these different levels happening in the play, and we're kind of not sure at any, and even we're in such early stages of developing ourselves, so when I say we're not sure, I mean the audience, and me and Sophia are writing a piece, or her writing a piece at the moment, because we're not sure about anything. But yeah, where it kind of sits in terms of, is some of this in her mind, or has the house been hacked by someone from the outside, or is he controlling the house, and we kind of like at different points are trying to navigate. So it's kind of this really traditional supernatural horror tripe of a haunted house and being stuck in your house at the same time as this kind of future thing, at the same time as this kind of real world situation that is happening. But yeah, lots of like really like even A Doll's House has been another kind of really interesting reference for us, just in kind of some of the language that we'd use her in terms of like, is she always burning the food when they've got guests over and like embarrassing herself, but is he actually just kind of like turning the oven up a little bit, or is she's got an important meeting at work that day, does the water scald her in the shower, and kind of like how is he just kind of constantly undermining her in that space using kind of home automation technology.
There's a great scene, Clara, they did a workshop version at down the road. There's a scene where the husband is got spyware on the wife, but is controlling the blinds in the morning, and the kind of sunlight, kind of flowing onto his wife, such that he can see her wake up with the light kind of hitting her eyes and stuff. And it's like, it's framed in a kind of positive, loving way, but it's so icky and disgusting.
Yeah.
And a bit like, anyone seen Parasite, that fantastic film? The notion of controlling a house before you arrive. It's so.
Yeah, we found a really interesting article in the development, which was called Dichotomies in the Power and Control Story, which was talking about the kind of power and control narrative which exists. Because I think one of the really challenging things for us is it's really easy to find accounts, or not, but like accounts of victims who have been through it talking about experiences, but it was really hard to find for Sophia as a writer and me as a director how you find your way into it from a perpetrator point of view, and kind of what those driving forces are, and nobody seeing themselves, I guess, as the villain in their own story. So what are those narratives which they create, and how much are the things that they do an act of loving that person, and when does kind of intoxicating love become too much, and like, yeah, where is this kind of like weird transition period between him playing a song to her over the music that's their song, but then that kind of like repetition, or like when does it become too much? I guess being, yeah, really interesting, that slow incrementation of kind of things being taken away and lines being crossed, but what's the intention and where's it? Just, yeah.
So essentially this tangent is a big advertisement for this future production. It should be great. It is interesting though, what you were saying, Julia, before about, we stand we side with this character. We want to see them find justice. And we've talked about this before, the notion of crime thrillers, but in the theatre and in, the proliferation of CSI Miami, CSI Glenelg. We want to see justice done. We're obsessed with the crime drama. And Gaslight the play and the film has that quality as well. We want to see justice brought to Bella Manningham. What is it about the crime thriller that is so appealing to us in all forms of literature?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I think it's so fascinating listening to you because you're just picking up so many themes throughout that come up in these, both all the 1940s films that I was talking about earlier, by the way, which are all based on Gothic novels, usually by female novelists, so like Daphne du Maurier and those kind of people, or the more kind of contemporary ones. But they're, fundamentally they're dramas of uncertainty. So they are, dramas of uncertainty that are kind of lodged or originate in the domestic space. So, it's a woman in a house that's usually way outside for her, almost a parasite-sized house, some kind of massive house. There's usually a room that she doesn't have access to. There's often a secret that is either lodged in the attic or, in some space that she's not quite, again, not allowed access to. And then it's somehow articulated around the problem in vision. So this is also fundamentally why it's such a cinematic kind of genre, I guess, or cycle of media, because, entertainment, because, so back to Gaslight, it was the lights that were flickering. So they did what they sort of could, if you like, with the technology of the day. One woman, also an Oscar for Best Art Direction, by the way. So, but then fast forward to The Invisible Man, she's married to an optics whiz guy, right? So he is a world leader in optics and creates a suit which makes him disappear, right? So, I don't know about the rest of you out there, but I mean, nothing would scare the bejesus out of me more than being in a room. It's bad enough being chased in a house by someone, but you're being locked in a room with someone, they're there, you're with someone else, but they, the invisible person is hiding, and the other person doesn't believe you, and the invisible person is threatening you. So we're just waiting for that other person to leave the room, and you're going to be alone with them.
We brought 3 in tonight. They'll be touching on the shoulder.
I hope not. But in all these cases, I think what's going on is, in a way, the uncertainty is actually being embraced. So we really need to distinguish. I mean, I think I saw, Mitchell, in some of the preparatory comments, not like you practice anything, but we're, this question, we live in a post-truth world, right? Quote unquote, right? Now, these are all good people out there, so I'm sure most of you hate that concept, and we all are firm believers in things like science, climate change science and so on. But, there's a certain political stride in the United States who wants to say that these things are irrelevant. Now, that's a really different denial, that's a really different kind of vision of uncertainty, if you like, than I think what these movies are delivering to us, which is, it's quite different. I mean, it's almost like embracing your own inability to control the whole world, which is in a way the very opposite of a kind of Trumpian approach, which is full of narcissistic hubris and pathological lies and that kind of thing. So.
An interesting, maybe, segue too, the notion of these things being examples of the restoration of order is kind of central to their appeal. When we do live in a Trumpian world where everything seems destabilised, the kind of notion of, I can find some justice and peace within these things.
Yeah, well, we do want them to triumph ultimately at the end. I mean, perhaps, though, they would be stronger objects in a way if they didn't. Certainly more realistic, I suppose, but entertainment has never brought reality to us, has it? It's sparked conversation, it's inspired a bit of awareness raising, and exactly what we're doing right now. So we don't expect their conclusions to mirror realities, but it could be quite interesting, really, if because the heroines do frequently, the female heroes do triumph at the end, almost without exception. So.
Yeah. I'm desperate to read my Trump quote out now, having got there. So there's a couple of articles that came out, both called Donald Trump is Gaslighting America, one for Vogue and one later in The Guardian. The one in Vogue said, a journalist called Lauren Duca said, The CIA officially determined that Russia intervened in our election, and President-elect Donald Trump dismissed the story as if it were a piece of fake news. Trump won the presidency by gaslight. His rise to power has awakened a force of bigotry by condoning and encouraging hatred, but also by normalising deception. In the Guardian article, a writer called Ariel Levy said, right now many Americans listening to their president are experiencing what I experienced frequently as a child. Nothing means anything and reality is being cancelled. There is confusion, there is chaos, everything is upside down and inside out. When facts and truth are being discredited, how is it possible to know what to believe, especially when it comes from someone we expect to embody both ethics and etiquette? So it is interesting. I mean, it's a huge example of someone trying to gaslight a nation or to convince people of what is known to be true to be false. In professional and political contexts, what does the panel think about the notion of is gaslighting a thing on that kind of larger level?
I'll jump in. 100%, absolutely. So if I'm not working with women in intimate relationships that are experiencing this, then we're talking about it in a professional context quite frequently as well. So, and it plays out in kind of colleague relationships as well as manager and employee relationships. So it happens across the board, and I think even on a larger scale than that as well. And exactly the same patterns that you would see in intimate relationships plays out in the workplace. I remember speaking to a colleague some time ago who was actually experiencing gaslighting, and she, as a psychologist, was having sessions with her patients interrupted by her manager, who would just walk in whenever he felt like it to tell her some piece of really useless, unhelpful information in an attempt to confuse and gaslight. So it happens across the board. It happens in organisations across the board that I've worked, people that I've worked with that work in lots of different industries.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Julia, you had a breath of kind of thought there.
Well, it's. I mean, I think I'm getting to reality now, but yeah, it sounds. I'm thinking pop culture-wise, though. Back to that. I think it's important, I guess, to think of these movies, though, as not, I guess, tamping down on that, but rather exposing that, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they don't kind of, the movie wraps up at the end and they all, Ingrid Bergman walks away and, it's all good at the end. But, what they do, first of all, the 99% of the time, the running time of the film has been seen there in her shoes quaking. So just, watching The Invisible Man the other night, I was literally crawled into like a bundle, kind of going, Mitchell made us come, why are we here? And, so the resolution time-wise literally took like 3 minutes at the end, but you're physically sitting there knotted up, your stomach in knots, the way you would be were at a workplace or were at, in all those environments that you're describing, or a domestic situation, I suppose.
Similarly, we were just talking before about the Jordan Peele film Get Out. I don't know if anyone's seen that, where an African-American man is kind of drawn into this house by this Catherine Keener, this, is kind of hypnotising him into kind of this terrible stasis. But the whole film is about get out. Which happens, as you say, in the last 2 minutes. But you spend the film going, if only, yeah. What do you think on a professional context?
Yeah, I was just having, I think my battery's going flat. Can people still hear me?
Yeah.
I was just having a thought about when Julia said before why we're drawn to, these movies or watching these movies. And I was thinking about maybe it's because when we think about these behaviours, or when I think about domestic violence, and if you think about it being a reflection of gender inequality, these things can happen on a continuum. So, and maybe we watch them or we're drawn to them because we can see moments in our own lives of kind of experiencing that. So anything subtle like, I remember being a young woman when I had my very first, serious boyfriend. He used to tell me what I should be wearing when we go out. And at the time, I thought nothing of it. I thought, he worries about what I look like, or at least I'll look nice. But as I got older and started to realise, that actually was a form of surveillance in its own right. And so we don't often know behaviour until it's kind of named. And so domestic violence is interesting also, and Amber might know this from speaking to patients about it as well, is often when I've interviewed women who have experienced domestic violence, they have never, or they've listened to it. It takes a while for them to recognise that that's what's been part of their life. And so I was just going back to thinking about, you know, all these things that we're kind of shocked by, or we wonder why we're watching. Maybe it resonates kind of somehow, we're looking for answers. Yeah.
I would say even from an evolutionary perspective, when we talk about things like information and how that helps with survival, I think sometimes, you know, watching these films and learning this stuff kind of provides us with information that might reduce our threat, you know, that actually helps us survive. So from a purely kind of evolutionary perspective, perhaps that's why we're drawn to those kind of, that morbid fascination stuff a little bit as well.
We're kind of jumping to my last question, but we'll come back. That notion of like film being a dictator of new social practice. So like The Accused, that fantastic Jodie Foster film, which came out in the late 80s, the notion of what is consent also was, you know, the notion of often film leading to kind of social change as well. I've read a great article about Thelma and Louise. I mean, the kind of the depiction of domestic violence in that, and like the kind of the fact that the women are not believed at any stage throughout their journey, and the terrible thing about the film, great film that it is, that their final choice is death. You know, so. But that led to these huge conversations about that is not your choice. You know, it's an interesting thing. Something you were talking about before, Sarah, the notion in Gaslight the play, there's very much a sense of Bella Manningham's isolation. She has no one to turn to but this inspector who arrives, who kind of reveals to her a series of events that help her know that she has been gaslit. There was a great play at Sydney Theatre Company last year, or the year before, called Lethal Indifference, which was about, similarly, the notion of women being increasingly isolated by their partner, that they have no resource, they don't know, and they're questioning their reality to a degree that they don't seek help. What are some of the kind of resources and strategies for women like that? I mean, how difficult is it for them to kind of find the help that they need?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I suppose also, you know, maybe Gaslight gives some indication, but also some of the things we've presented here, is that question of why doesn't she leave? Everyone has asked that question before. And so, you know, when we were trying to learn about domestic and family violence or learn about these behaviours, our culture and how we understand gender, we turn to her to try and get her to do things, understand it, fix it. So that question of why doesn't she leave is now considered not a great question. We should be asking, why does he perpetrate this? That's the question we need to be asking. But to answer your question about, you know, seeking help or resources, I also still like the question of why doesn't she just leave, because it exposes the enormity of actually being able to do that. And so when you look at gaslight, or if you understand psychological and emotional abuse and the erosion of self-esteem and self, it is so difficult to even be able to articulate that, to ask for the help. You add on the material consequences of living in isolation with a perpetrator, to where your education or your employment's been sabotaged or eroded, and then maybe you've got children who are also traumatised. So when you start to add these things up, the question of why doesn't she just leave is so loaded in and of itself. So if there's one little bit of, you know, kind of a takeaway message is that if a woman starts to tell you about these things, often women do it because they're just starting to test the waters. Who could they kind of tell or trust? And the best thing one can do is believe and listen to what she's saying. Research has actually shown that when a woman tells or reaches out and tests the water, if she gets a bad response, like say from a pastor or a friend or a colleague that says, "What? I wouldn't do that," or it can take her back years to try that again. So just a response of, "I believe you. Are you safe? Are you feeling fearful? just exploring those things can make a big difference for what a woman might do next.
That's what I found fascinating about your article, that's the report that's in the Flinders magazine. The notion of the domestic violence is not a female problem primarily, it's a male problem. So the actual work needs to be done there rather than resourcing the woman necessarily. Is that Clara?
One of the, we've started to really look into kind of like what the kind of next steps in the future of, I guess, technology in general is, and kind of one of the things I was listening to a podcast the other day talking about artificial intelligence and kind of like the next steps of, I guess, stuff like Fitbits, which are measuring heart rates and measuring, is that those sorts of things are going to start to predict our mental health and tell us when we need this vitamin and that vitamin and all that sort of thing. Is like that kind of added, like, you know, if your partner can track your heartbeat during the day and is also like really jealous, and at one point your heartbeat is like is he going to think that maybe you're having an affair, or he, like, just that kind of more privacy we're kind of continuously giving to technology for various things. And then also we were really interested in the idea of, but like, yeah, the fact that the more privacy we're giving over to technology, and if technology can be used by other people, then kind of those traps getting harder and harder in like a really scary way.
Quick question for Amber, maybe if you are in a situation where you can't, if it's even a professional situation, you can't necessarily just leave, or even a kind of intimate relationship where you can't just leave, what are some of the kind of strategies you recommend to people if they have to kind of deal with it from the inside?
Talking a lot to others, because that helps you to keep your reality and your identity and self-esteem intact. If you're getting that, I guess, information and acknowledgement from others that you're not going crazy. Recording, so journaling or writing down what's happening can be really, really useful, because again, when we think about that cumulative effect, we only really notice it when we see the bigger picture, when we've kind of got a narrative that when we look at it we realise, wow, this is not so good. Another thing that can be really helpful is dropping the defence. So recognising that if someone is blatantly lying to you, you don't even try to defend yourself against it. It's a waste of your energy, and it's remembering that it's actually the other person that has the problem, not you. So there's no need to defend yourself against that kind of behaviour. So I'm not talking about defending yourself against physical violence here, but against information, or someone accusing you of something, or saying that they haven't done something. And also remembering that just because someone's really articulate, just because they might be able to run rings around you in an argument, doesn't mean that they're right. Because quite often that's another thing that we find is that, a client of mine might say that he's got all the answers and he knows exactly what to say, and he says it so well, and I can't find the words. So just remember that being articulate does not equal being right as well. That's probably the main ones.
That's great stuff. Yeah, fantastic. Wonderful. We've got about 5 minutes left for questions. Valdis.
So, listening to your examples of when you're mediating a relationship or a work institution situation, where you have that sort of blatant gaslighting, you're walking into a counselling session or that, can that person be fixed, or in most of the time you just have to write it off and move on?
Sarah I think the difficulty in private practice, in clinical practice, is that quite often the person that seeks help is the victim, the gaslightee. So that makes it really difficult for us to start to actually make a difference. And what I do find is in situations where I encourage the person to encourage their partner to seek help, that those attempts will be sabotaged. So they might be suggesting to their partner to get couples counselling or to go and get their own support. And there'll be lots of cancelled GP appointments, lots of cancelled counselling appointments, lots of promises that it will happen. But quite often it is very difficult to get the other person to firstly acknowledge that there's a problem, and secondly then get the support for it.
So at the end of the day, typically recommend to cut the losses and move on.
If I see that someone's in a really unsafe situation, I will let them know that it's probably a good idea to look for ways out. Yeah.
Anne?
I just wondered whether this gaslighting situation or domestic violence occurs in same-sex couples as much or with the same frequency as in heterosexual couples. And are they just as likely to seek help or not seek help?
Interestingly, we've just filmed a monologue for the Decameron. As you might know, in the Decameron there's a stream of queer writers and First Nations writers and the Theatre of Global Majority writers as well. And one of the pieces we've just filmed is about a young gay man who's in a situation of domestic violence where he's kind of been feminised by the assailant into a kind of position of weakness, and you're hysterical, you're crazy. So I do think it happens a lot there as well. But again, it's that notion of gendering the kind of relationship, even though they're same-sex partners, so that someone is the crazy one and someone is the rational one. So I don't know data per se. Maybe Sarah knows more about that in terms of those actual situations. But I would imagine it's prevalent there as well.
Yeah, the statistics say yes, it is similar to heterosexual in same-sex relationships. So the thing about that's really common across the board, so there is no one culture, ethnicity, race or sexuality that is worse than the other. Like, we just can't prove that. It's just across the board. It doesn't matter which country you live in, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, it doesn't matter if you're in a same-sex relationship or not. These behaviours of what we call domestic violence are similar across the board. It is a global phenomenon that we see in its diversity.
Well, I've got family who work in the police force too, and they've said during COVID there has been an increase in kind of domestic violence cases being reported as well, because that notion of isolation being more intense. Have you found that in your practice, Amber? Or?
Absolutely, and one of the biggest challenges is women who were at the point where they were ready to leave, and then due to restrictions, so being unable to travel interstate, for example, where they might have been able to set up safe spaces for themselves, or lots of other reasons. Employment issues mean that a lot of women have become stuck in situations.
I'll just add, it's interesting and good to hear you say that, because I think just back to our entertainment and cultural sphere, you will have all noticed that all the movies that we've talked about are all with white heroines. And that was one thing that was interesting and making me think about, when I came in, is this an idealized kind of white woman's problem in these films? And so hearing you confirm, no, it is actually in fact in every culture, so that's interesting to bear in mind.
Absolutely. Probably time for a couple more, yes?
A question for Amber. A few years ago, it's about to do with gender roles and gender expectations in society. A few years ago, a friend had a guide dog puppy that was a really little puppy, and we could take her all around the place. And I would frequently walk her through the city, as did she. And whenever she walked it through the city, she'd get a lot of advice about how to look after the dog. What to feed it, how to clean it, how she was leading it, how she should hold the lead. I would never get any advice. Everyone just say, what a cute puppy. And we actually came to the conclusion that there was a sort of an expectation in society, both with men and with women, that men are competent and women are not. And I think it leads into this whole thing, and it's part of what allows a lot of this behaviour. I'm just wondering if you see that, and whether that's a fair observation.
Absolutely. Sarah's probably even more able to talk to that one.
That's a really interesting point. In domestic violence or child protection contexts, we often call, there is a lot of mother blame, and good enough fathering is what we kind of talk about. So the expectations for a mother to protect her children when there's violence in the home, or the expectations of a mother when there's child abuse and neglect, are extremely high. So we position women as better in terms of being caring, and so we put all these expectations on women to protect, nurture, care. The child's future rides on her shoulders, where we see the opposite in men. So we call it good enough fathering. So when a man shows an interest in his children and he happens to take them to the footy for an hour, he's just bloody marvellous. And so he gets a lot of kudos for it.
The thing that really struck us too was a lot of the advice would come from women to the female leading the dog, who knew exactly what to do with the dog.
So these are dominant these are dominant kind of constructions of how we understand masculinity and femininity. And I think we've progressed a long way in society, but those dominant ideas still exist. You see them in the everyday all the time. For example, you know, with the COVID restrictions and the isolation, I was only reading the other day in The Guardian that the COVID is very gendered in and of itself. So it's women that have mainly lost a lot of their jobs because they were part-time workers or casual workers, or worked in retail, or worked in you know, the caring. Yeah, so again, these are dominant understandings of gender that kind of affect our everyday, and that's an example of it as well.
And I think ultimately one of the reasons we program Gaslight, because even though it is a, you know, and Catherine's been very clear to say in the press that at the end of the day it is an entertainment and a thriller, but ultimately it is a really great theatrical exploration of notions of masculinity and femininity, and certainly in her production she's hoping to kind of excavate that more while entertaining you as well. So listen, I think on that note, can you please join me in thanking this wonderful panel here. So hopefully following the season of Gaslight, we'll be back at the Playhouse with David Lindsay-Abair's play Ripcord that I'm directing the wonderful Nancy Hayes and Carmel Johnson in. And there'll be quite a different tangent to talk about that play, I imagine. But we really appreciate you coming out tonight, and please tell your friends about the show. And we thank these wonderful people for lending their expertise and intelligence to this evening. Thank you.